Chapter 10 The Garden. Sora, Kairi, and Max were on the bridge in their seats as Sora piloted the Highwind onto Radiant Garden, landing it vertically in an alley just outside of the marketplace. With a small thud, the landing gear made contact with the pavement. Sora unlocked his seatbelt as he brought the ship's power systems down to a minimum. Rising from his seat, he motioned for Max and Kairi to follow. I wonder how much Radiant Garden has changed since the last time I was here, he thought. Descending the landing ramp, Sora looked around at the familiar stone buildings surrounding the ship as he breathed in the familiar scent of the Radiant Garden. He turned his head to the red-haired girl standing beside him. "Welcome home," he said, slowly reaching for her hand. Kairi eyed his hand, her own slowly inching its way toward his. "No," she replied, their fingers touching. "I was only born here. Home is where my heart is." Kairi slid her outstretched hand into his as her eyes rose from their now entwined hands to Sora's blue eyes. "And that's with you, Sora." Sora nodded and took a pace forward, leading her onward. He rounded the corner with Max in the rear, and they were awed at the sight they beheld. The marketplace had changed dramatically. Instead of being just a square with a few shops surrounding it, there was a large meeting square with alleys and branches stretching off in all directions, all of them bristling with shops, open market stalls, outdoor cafes, and even two vendors advertising Scrooge McDuck's sea salt ice cream. Townspeople were bustling about everywhere. Men, women, children, and seniors were going around shopping, the children mostly hanging out around their parents and the ice cream. But the thing that most astounded the trio was the number of teenagers there were in the crowd. Teens were strolling about just about everywhere, chatting in the square, eating ice cream and shopping. Sora even noticed one gaggling group of girls that each held 4 to 5 shopping bags. "Wow," Max stuttered. "There are sure a lot of teens here." Sora gulped. "I know," he said, awestruck. "I never knew we were protecting this many kids our age from the heartless." Sora turned his head to look at Kairi, who simply stood with a stunned look on her face. Sora shook his arm slightly. "Kairi," he said, "are you okay?" "I'm their princess," she said as she slowly brought her face toward Sora. "What if they want me to rule over them?" Max chuckled behind them. Kairi turned to look at him. "What is it?" she asked. "Well," Max said, "last we heard from Leon, the Radiant Garden Restoration Committee set up a system of government, and the people elected Leon Prime Minister." Max gave them a few seconds for it to sink in before continuing. "So, that means Leon's in charge, and you don't have to do anything, Kairi." She smiled warmly at Max. "Thanks for telling us, Max," she said kindly. "Now we can just be normal teens fighting the forces of evil." Sora laughed heartily at Kairi's comments. A passing teenage girl looked in their direction upon hearing Sora's laughter. Look of utter surprise claimed her visage, and as she screamed loudly. Instinctively, Sora and Kairi released each other's hands as they drew the Oblivion and the Oathkeeper out of thin air. Suddenly alert and wary, Max simply raised his eyebrows as he slowly sinked away. He knew what was happening. "By Jenova!" the girl screeched loud enough for the whole marketplace to hear. "It's Sora!" What appeared to be a whole 100 heads turned in their direction as Max continued to retreat into the shadows. "Did I forget to mention," he said slowly, "that you're famous, Sora?" Sora and Kairi whipped their heads around and stared at Max, their keyblades flashing. Suddenly a great roar erupted behind them as a horde of teenagers, mostly girls, began to dash towards them, screaming wildly. "I can't believe it's Sora!" one yelled. "I know," another one shouted. "Did you see his keyblade?" Sora and Kairi quickly began backing away in the wake of the crowd. "Hey, who's that girl he's with?" a random girl in the crowd asked rather loudly. Sora's eyes grew with fear. "Kairi," he squeaked. He turned around to look at him while they continued backing away. Sora half turned his head in her direction. "Run." In one fluid motion, they both turned their backs on the crowd and bolted down an alley, grabbing hands as they fled. "Why are you running, Sora?" Roxas asked with a chuckle. "They're just fangirls." Sora huffed as he continued to flee. "Hey, would you like to be out here running?" Sora yelled in his mind. That shut Roxas up. "Hey," a boy yelled. "I think that's that Kairi girl. Isn't she a princess or something?" Another guy who was at the head of the pack asked. Kairi threw her head over her shoulder, but Sora tugged on her arm to keep her concentrating on running. I think she's our princess," another guy said in a slightly confused voice before picking up in excitement. "Hey, did you see her Keyblade? How cool is that? We have a princess who's also a wielder of the Keyblade." "Princess and wielder or not," a girl yelled savagely as she fought her way to the head, "no one is good enough for Sora except me." Kari's eyes steeled as fire erupted in them, and she began resisting Sora's pull. Sora threw a glance back at Kari, not entirely shocked at what he saw. "You want to?" he asked. Kari nodded. "Gladly," she said. Sora and Kari came to a halt and turned to face the mob of screaming fans. The horde surrounded them, leaving no avenue for escape. The girls started inching towards Sora, giving Kari looks of pure loathing, while the few guys just stared at Kari, jaws slacked. She blushed at the boys and smiled sweetly, causing them to pass out in bliss. Kari looked smugly at Sora. "Now that they've been taken care of," she said. Suddenly 2 girls standing behind her grabbed her free arm and whipped her away from Sora. She landed hard on the pavement, and since their only barrier to getting close to Sora was removed, the fangirls flung themselves en masse at him, rolling and kicking Kari further away. The high-heeled shoes of a few of them dug into her skin, adding a few fresh cuts and scrapes her arms and legs had already received from the pavement. "Kari!" Sora yelled as he lost sight of her in the sea of girls. His eyes glazed over in fear as the crowd would trample her. "Forget her," a pretty girl with long blonde hair who grabbed his right arm said seductively. "Forget her and kiss me." Her words cut into Kari worse than her physical injuries as she lay on the ground. Whether Sora refused or not, Kari knew that the girl would kiss him anyway. She was determined that Kari would not see it. The crowd suddenly oohed, and Kari knew that her worst fears were confirmed. A pearly tear fell from her eye, and she sniffed. "Why, Namine?" Kari asked. "Why?" Before Namine could respond, Kari could hear a rustling sound as if there was a struggle, and she could barely hear the muttered curses of the girl who had just kissed Sora. "Get out of my sight, you vixen!" Sora snarled as he tried to break free and find Kari. A few boys who had regained consciousness helped him out. "You may think that you're beautiful, but your heart betrays you. You think I fell in love for beauty?" The mob stilled, and Sora brutally shoved his way through. A few girls who were standing in front of Kari, concealing her, bowed their heads in shame and parted for Sora. Sora looked and saw Kari lying down with her back to him. Her red hair had become dusty with dirt, and lacerations, dirt and gravel were scattered all over her arms and legs. Surprisingly, her pure white leather breastplate wasn't dirty at all, and neither was her rose skirt. "Kari!" Sora called in haste as he dashed up to her. Green light had already curling around his fingers. He knelt by her side and placed his hands over her. "Kira," Sora said softly. The green healing magic wrapped around Kari, healing her cuts and scrapes, though still leaving her hair disheveled. Kari turned herself over, Sora's arms resting under her shoulder as he propped her up. It pained him to see the pearly tear staining her cheek. Sora smiled warmly at Kari as he gently wiped it away with his thumb. "I fell in love for the strength and the beauty of the heart," he said quietly, more to Kari than the crowd. Kari smiled as she cupped her arm around his shoulders, allowing him to help her up. As soon as she stood, Kari threw her arms around her boyfriend's shoulders and happily lost herself in his eyes. Sora responded by wrapping his arms around her back and pulling her close, gazing into her own sapphire eyes. They bent their foreheads together, still madly gazing at each other. Kari grinned. "I love you," she said softly. Sora grinned in return. "And I love you," he replied, before their lips quickly covered the distance between them and met. Sora and Kari both felt resurgence of the flame of passion within them as they kissed. Sora's fingers danced along the revealed skin of her lower back as Kari's hands rubbed and massaged his shoulder blades and back. They slowly broke to rabid cheers and applause from those surrounding them. They looked at the teenagers surrounding them, all the guys who had now regained consciousness, and one was sniffling. But most held looks of admiration at Sora, and one was even giving him a thumbs up. Girls, on the other hand, were a different story, but many of them were crying, reasons numerous, and several, including the girl who had kissed Sora, were fuming away and stalked away, knowing they could no longer stand a chance. Sora and Kari blushed slightly, not really embarrassed at the situation. Could anyone tell me, Sora asked uncertainly, how to get to the burrow? So this place changed a lot since I was last here. Before anyone in the crowd could answer, a feminine voice spoke up behind the crowd. You need to get to Merlin, Sora? Sora and Carrie looked up as the crowd parted to see a woman with long brown hair wearing a pink and white dress. She stepped forward towards the two. Max is already over there. Even Leon left his new office to greet you there. Sora smiled warmly. Yeah, he said, if you could show us the way, Aerith. Aerith smiled and clapped her hands together. Okay, to Merlin's then. She then looked around at all the people before her face became stern. What are y'all doing here? She growled, giving the crowd a harsh glare. Go back to your business. In the space of 5 seconds, the crowd had broken up and headed off in all directions, whispering to each other about what they had just seen. Why can't we ever kiss like that? One girl whispered quietly to her boyfriend, loud enough for Sora and Carrie to hear, but not Aerith, as they passed by. The girl winked an emerald eye at Carrie when her boyfriend threw his arms up in the air. Carrie giggled quietly as Aerith led them away. I like that girl, Naminé said in Carrie's head. I do too, Carrie replied. I probably would have liked all of them if they didn't try to trample me and try to take Sora away from me. At least I know nobody can take Roxas from me, Naminé said slyly. Carrie smirked. If you paid attention, you would know like I do that Sora's going to stay with me to the end. And there's no way I'm leaving him after what he just did. Aerith led Sora and Carrie to the back of the alley before making a quick left turn. Taking Sora into familiar territory, directly in front of him was the cement staircase that led up to the outer wall of the Bailey. Another quick left turn, and they were standing directly in front of the wooden door of Merlin the Wizard's house. Sora heaved a sigh as his fingers stretched towards the doorknob. Carrie looked quizzically at him. What's wrong? She asked, her question startled as he turned his head. What? Oh, nothing. Just thinking. Sora grasped the knob and opened the door. The inside looked just as he remembered it. On the wall directly to his right, several blueprints were tacked up. Directly opposite the door was Sid's giant computer screen with the portable blackboard on the wheels separating it from the rest of the room. On the other side of the board were numerous stacks of books and scrolls Merlin studied, while in the center there was a circular brick platform that held a round table with 2 chairs, including a large red armchair surrounding it. On the table was a tea set, and on the far wall there was a bookcase, a stove, and a wardrobe, a bed, and a pedestal with a book of Pooh on it. Were on the wall opposite the door. On the other side of the blackboard, more books were scattered throughout. Standing inside the room were 4 figures. Max was standing next to a man with spiked blonde hair who had a toothpick in his teeth. The man wore a white t-shirt and a pair of blue jeans. Opposite him was a tall man with long brown hair. This man was marked with a scar on his left cheek and wore a black vest over top a white shirt with matching black pants. The fourth standing figure was an old man wearing white and blue robes. He had a very long white beard and wore a pointed blue cap and round glasses. There were 3 others in the room. However, they were all girls and were about 6 inches tall, and they were floating. One with short mocha hair and very strange eyes. One was green and the other blue. She wore a white shirt over a pair of incredibly short black jean shorts. Over top the jean shorts were on one side was a feathered skirt alternating between blue and white, yellow bikini top, and a tiny pair of green denim shorts. Her eyes were very strange. They were both green, but her pupils were spirals. The third had spiked silver hair. The normal eyes wore a black shawl wrapped around her upper chest, and long black pants and boots. They were all congregated around a table discussing current events, but they stopped and turned to greet the new arrivals. Sora, the man with the scar on his cheek, said, "It's good to see you again." Yeah, the blonde man added, "if you ain't in top shape." Sora nodded to each of them, and Kyrie stepped forward to shake hands with them. "Kyrie," the scarred man continued, "nice to see you again, too." Kyrie placed a finger to her chin. Leon, right?" she asked. He nodded his head, and Kyrie smiled. "Good. It's nice to know I haven't forgotten all of you since Traverse Town." The man with the toothpick nudged her. "Who am I, then?" he asked. Kyrie began to concentrate. What was his name again? The man held up 3 fingers and said, I'll give you a clue. 3 letters. Carrie's face lightened as she remembered. Sid, she answered. Sid's face beamed and he gave her a nuggie. Carrie fought him off and turned to the man wearing blue. And you're Merlin, she said, pointing. Merlin bowed and removed his cap. Correct, princess, he said. Carrie simply sighed and shook her head before turning to the 3 floating girls. I'm sorry, she apologized, but I don't know your names. The 3 girls didn't look disappointed at all, but took it all in stride. I'm Yuna, the girl with the one with the mocha hair wearing white said, introducing herself and placing a hand over her heart. I'm Riku, energetically exclaimed the blonde one, pumping the air. The girl wearing black crossed her arms and looked Carrie over. Pain, she announced. Yuna took it up from there. Together, we're the Gullwings. Pain was still looking Carrie over when a smile grew over her face, and she looked at Sora. She's a good match, Sora. I approve. Riku looked at Yuna in surprise. Oh, Yuni, tu drago goof yupui dra beldina? Riku asked. Yuna turned to her. Tud drek ku Riku? Sora and Carrie stared strangely at the 2 hovering girls. What did you say? Sora asked, half pointing at them. Yuna looked at him. Oh, nothing, she said coyly, her arms behind her back. Leon cleared his throat. So, Sora, he said, bringing attention to himself. You're all fighting the Heartless again? Sora nodded. Yeah, and Carrie's fighting too. Sora pushed his arm towards her, and she beamed, summoning the Oathkeeper. Merlin stepped forward towards Carrie and began examining her. If you're going to fight with a Keyblade, he said, you're going to have to learn magic. Carrie nodded her head. I know, she said. Sora's always taught me the fire elements. Merlin looked up in surprise. Very good, he explained. And it seems your armor and skirts are akin to Sora's garments. They'll gather magical energy from the world around you, which means, he explained, that it will take less energy to cast spells and you will regain your mana faster. But that is not enough. Merlin shifted his attention towards Sora as Carrie dismissed the Oathkeeper. Sora, I entrust you with the task of teaching Kyrie, as it seems you've already done some training with her. The Radiant Garden gang all looked knowingly at the 2. Sora and Kyrie looked around, puzzled at their friends' faces. Why are you looking at us like that? Kyrie asked. Sid just chuckled and drew from a pocket what appeared to be a picture, but Sora couldn't see what it was of. We received this in a transmission from your world a few days ago, he explained, striding towards them. Sid handed the picture to Sora upside down in order to forestall him seeing it. Harry took 2 steps forward and peered over Sora's shoulder to see what it was. He looked up at her and gave Kyrie a curt nod. Looking back down, Sora flipped over the picture. It was his and Kyrie's first kiss. Each of them looked at each other and blushed, so that's how everyone knew. Riku looked at Yuna again. Kiak, Drago, Goof, Hoof. But if everyone knew because they had this picture, Roxas said in Sora's mind, who took the picture? Sora's face hardened at the same time Kyrie's did. Evidently, Naminé had said the exact same thing. Sora pocketed the picture and stared at Leon. Yuffie, Leon said, answering the unspoken question. Sora turned to look at Kyrie. When we get back, he said, let's kill her. Kyrie's complexion changed as she smiled and giggled. Sora's face shifted from one of anger to confusion. We'd probably have to fight Riku first, she said. Yuffie said she was beginning to like him. Sora gasped and turned to Sid. Make sure she knows that you know, he ordered. Sid saluted. Will do, Sora. Aerith then cleared her throat and stepped forward. So, apart from you 2 getting together, what else has happened? She asked. Not much, Sora replied. What about here? Everyone looked at Leon, who sighed. Well, I'm representing the people of Radiant Garden, he explained. As you probably noticed, the city changed somewhat. Ever since Sid and Tron were able to enhance the Claymores to such an extent that the Heartless were evicted from the town, and people have been coming out of hiding and contributing their skills, resources, and labor into making this town the best place to live. No one used to come out of their houses before. Now many people are out in the open, including our young. Kyrie raised her eyebrows. We noticed, she said, jerking her head at Sora. Max and the Goldwings laughed. Fans got you down, Sora? Payne asked. Sora slowly nodded and smiled at Kyrie. But not for long, he answered, giving Kyrie a chest kiss on the cheek. Leon sighed. Anyway, he started, but before he could continue, a large explosion shook the house. In haste, the whole party ran from the house towards the outer wall of the bailey. Protected the burrow, Sora looked over at the ramparts to see a sea of Heartless below them. Oh no, he thought in fear. Not again. He looked to see Kyrie and Max in a cold sweat. They've probably never seen so many Heartless. Well, Kyrie has, but she never had to fight this many. Sora turned his head to see each member of the Radiant Garden Restoration Committee staring resolutely at the Heartless. Leanne caught his eye and nodded. I'm not going to let this many destroy everything we've built again, squalled Leonhart, growled before drawing his gun blade. A long sword where a section near the hilt was a revolver. Sora, let's go. Sora nodded curtly and motioned for Kyrie and Max. Kyrie turned to him slowly, fear clutching her. Sora, she said weakly. He turned and ran to her side, his arm swinging itself around her shoulders. Don't worry, Kyrie, he said in a comforting tone. You'll be okay. You fight just as well as I do. Sora then turned to Max, whose expression was rippled in terror. Well, Max, he said, now's your chance to prove yourself to me. Max gulped and nodded slowly. Sora turned back to Kyrie, who was shaking her head to rid herself of fear. You're right, she said slowly, before a look of determination claimed her face. Let's go, she let out courageously. Kyrie bolted, leaving Sora and Max to start half a second after her. All right, Riku exclaimed, upon flying off to join the others. Don't worry, Radiant Garden. Your friendly neighborhood Goldwings are on the job. Sora smirked at her remark as he ran into the bailey. Upon entrance, Sora stopped moving as dozens of circular beams of light shot down to the ground about a meter above it. Little silver-blue spherical balls appeared from them and began rapidly moving towards the ground, towards their targets. Sora noticed Max and Kyrie watching them with apprehension. Don't worry, Sora said, with a laugh. Those are just the claymores, the town's defense mechanism. Kyrie looked at him. So they're on our side? She asked quickly. Sora nodded and chased after the claymores after summoning the Oblivion, as he prepared to charge into the unseen Heartless horde. He vaulted the brick railing on the side of the stairs and saw the fiends. There was a massive army of Heartless behind the warped remains of what appeared to be an iron gate. In the front of the gate, claymores were constantly sliding under the feet of the Heartless and exploding, dissipating them. Sora could barely see what kind of Heartless they were, due to Leon, the others, and the explosion of the claymores created. Yet the sound of them was enough to convince Sora that he knew what they were. It was clicking and clacking sound, and an image of an armored knight appeared in his mind, a body surrounded by great armor with a pointed helm and swords serving as its arms and legs. Sora opened his eyes to see red hair dashing past him. Kyrie was on the move. Sora grinned as he prepared himself for the fight ahead of him when he felt a hand on his shoulder. Max was standing behind him, holding a long silver sword with a golden hilt in his right hand, a red bandana in his left. Sora, he said quietly, holding out his sword, could you hold this for me for a second? Sora grabbed the sword's hilt with his free hand and stared at Max, perplexed as Max tied the bandana to on his head. Max looked at Sora. Roxanne gave this to me, he explained, and I'm going to wear it from now on as a reminder to come back to her, so I can tell her how I feel about her. Sora nodded in understanding as he handed back Max's sword. Would you like me to watch your back? He asked. Max shook his head. I appreciate the offer, Sora, he said, but I want to prove to myself first that I can fight and won't have to rely on others. Sora chuckled to himself at Max's comment. He raised his eyebrows. What? Sora grinned slightly and closed his eyes. Two things, Sora began humorously. One, you're beginning to sound like my friend Riku, and two, Sora opened his eyes and looked at Max, you always need someone watching your back. You won't believe how many times your father and Donald saved my hide. Max chuckled. Fair point, he replied, grinning, but I want to go this one alone. Sora nodded slowly. Even though Max idolized him, if Sora couldn't talk him out of it, there was no point in trying further. Just be careful, Max, Sora sighed. You want to make it back to Roxanne in one piece. Max nodded before rushing past Sora towards the remains of the gate. Sora turned to address the current situation. Kyrie, Leon, and the Goldwings had already beaten the Heartless back past the gates.
and could no longer receive help from the town's claymores. Aerith, Merlin, and Sid were standing behind the remains of the gate. Sora walked up to them as Max rushed out past them. "What are you three going to do?" he asked. Merlin raised a hand. "I am going to go up on the outer wall and cast powerful magic spells at these infernal Heartless." Sid then jabbed a thumb at himself. "I'm going to stay here with my spear and beat back any Heartless that make it through you guys in the front lines," he explained. "And if the claymores go on the fritz, I'll hold the Heartless until Tron can figure out what's wrong and fix them." Sora turned his attention to Aerith. She put a hand over her heart upon seeing his gaze. "I'm going out with you guys," she said. "I know I can't fight as well as the others, but I'll heal you if you all get hurt. If anything attacks me, I'll strike back with my quarterstaff." Sora nodded and walked past the gate. "Stay close to Leon," he muttered as he passed Aerith. Aerith blushed, before she could even scold him. Sora dashing off into the fray, the Oblivion poised in front of him. He arrived next to Kairi, and his first slash went straight through an Arbor Knight's armor, dispelling the darkness and releasing its hearts. "Perfect timing," Kairi said as she repeatedly slashed at several Heartless, creating cracks in their armor. Sora saw that one was spinning on the ground, about to scythe its way through Kairi's legs. "Watch out!" Sora yelled as he rose into the air, forcefully lunging down on it. Keyblade in front of him, Kairi looked just in time to see Sora dive straight through it. He proceeded to use the maneuver 4 more times around them, ripping through several Heartless at once. When he dropped to the ground, he looked at Kairi. "Don't worry, Kai," he said. "I've got your back." Kairi smiled, but quickly pointed the Oathkeeper slightly to Sora's side. A large fireball formed on its tip. "Fire!" Kairi said. A large fireball shot out from her Keyblade's tip and hurled past Sora. He turned inside to see it vaporize an Arbor Knight that was about to slice open his back. Sora turned back at Kairi in wonder to see her smirking and resting the Oathkeeper on her shoulder. "Or do I have your back?" she asked smugly. Sora grinned and swiftly turned around and stabbed Heartless in the head. And so the battle began. The army of Heartless was truly massive. After the defenders of Radiant Garden were able to drive them back past the cliffs and the crystal fissure to the Great Maw, the Heartless were able to drive a wedge between them, each defender in only short minutes, isolating them in a ring of foes. Each person was an island, constantly assailed by the dark waves. Leanne was defending Aerith with his gunblade. Kairi was valiantly fighting on her own. Max was proving himself, or so he thought. Yuna, Riku, and Pain had each pulled out a miniature pistol, a set of long knives with round hilts, and a sword, respectively and viciously defending themselves. Sora blocked an attack. One Arbor Knight threw at him and viciously attacked it, hacking and those around it to pieces. Unbeknownst to him, an Armored Knight was creeping up behind him. Sora dodged a laser blast from a surveillance robot had fired at him, and continued pressing forward, not knowing about the foe to his rear. "Sora, behind you!" Roxas shouted. Sora turned to see it attacking with a downward slash. He raised the Oblivion to block it, but before the blow could connect, the Heartless disappeared with a blinding flash, and Sora was forced to shield his eyes from. When he opened them, he saw the tips of an Oblivion and an Oathkeeper directly where the Heartless had stood. Sora followed the blades to their hilts, astounded. Holding the weapons was a blue-eyed boy with spiked blonde hair, wearing a black shirt, white vest, gray pants, and black shoes. On his chest was the 4-pointed pendant. It was Roxas, an opaque Roxas. "Roxas!" Sora gasped, amazed at the sight. "How are you real?" Roxas quickly looked at him over and tightened his grip on the keyblades before swinging the Oblivion at Sora. Sora raised his own and parried the blow, striking back at Roxas, who blocked it with the Oathkeeper. "What are you doing?" Sora growled angrily. Roxas's eyes widened as realization struck him. "I am real," he said slowly. Sora sighed and decided to repeat his question. "But how?" he asked. Roxas shrugged. "Not sure," he answered. "Magical mythical powers of the Keyblade?" He shook his head. "But now isn't the time for answers. The Heartless are going to destroy themselves. Aren't going to destroy themselves, you know." Sora nodded. "Right," he said before leaping back into the fray. Roxas jumped in behind him, wielding his 2 Keyblades with top proficiency. "Nominate," Roxas thought, while eviscerating a large green ball of a Heartless known as a Morning Star. "Can you hear me?" He didn't have to wait long for a reply. "Yes, Roxy?" she asked. "I'm real," Roxas said. There was a long pause from Nominate as the battle raged around everyone. "What?" Naminé screamed. But how? I don't know, Roxas answered as he jumped to avoid the laser Sora through use of the surveillance robot was using to destroy a large swath of Heartless, but it may have something to do with the Keyblades. Well, Naminé started. Roxas raised his eyebrow. Well, what, Nam? Well, since Kairi can wield a Keyblade, maybe I can and become real too. Roxas slowly shook his head. Go ahead and try, Naminé. Just don't get yourself killed. I doubt neither Kairi nor myself could live if that happened. Several meters away, nearly out of sight due to the hordes of Heartless, Kairi was holding her own against the army of Heartless. She had sustained a few scratches and cuts to her arms, but every slash that connected against her leather breastplate did not harm her, nor did it cut through the leather. The same was mostly true of her skirt. It would not tear or rip no matter how many swords were brought against it. Although being a skirt, it offered nowhere near the amount of protection her breastplate offered, so Kairi was sure that she would have several purple bruises on her thighs when the battle was over. Kairi parried a spinning attack an armored knight was about to use and leapt high, fiercely attacking anything below her with a single powerful blow. Landing crouched on her feet, Kairi deftly rose and twirled around, Keyblade extended, to hack through Heartless in her immediate area. She briefly smirked as she saw their pink hearts rise into the sky. She turned around to see a spectral figure of Naminé standing behind her. Naminé was concentrating on what Kairi couldn't tell. Naminé, she asked, what are you doing? Trying to see if I have a Keyblade I can summon, Naminé irritably resounded. Kairi giggled. She couldn't picture Naminé fighting with a Keyblade. Suddenly there was a bright flash of light, and Naminé had become solid. In her hand she was holding Island's fire. Kairi's eyes widened in amazement as she gazed at the golden blade. Naminé opened her eyes upon feeling the Keyblade's weight in her hands. She smiled and jumped up and down, thoroughly excited. I did it! She exclaimed. I have my own Keyblade! She looked herself over and began feeling her abdomen. And I'm real! Kairi sighed before leaping behind Naminé and destroying a Heartless that was about to make mincemeat out of her nobody. That's great, Naminé, she said breathlessly, but can you fight? Naminé became quite taken aback at Kairi's comment, before smiling and slightly shrugging. Then why are you out here to fight? Kairi gasped. Hey, Roxas is real too, Naminé pouted, placing her hands on her hips. He's fighting with Sora, and I thought now would be the perfect time to learn, right? Kairi gasped exasperatedly before her eyes became wide with fear. Watch out, she yelled. Naminé started and twisted around to see what was behind her, her hair swinging with fear. An armored knight had just slashed at her, but it missed with Naminé's sudden movements and only cut a few strands of hair. Naminé quickly placed her hands to her blonde locks to examine the damage. My hair, she said slowly. That Heartless cut my hair. Naminé's eyes hardened as a fire grew in them. That son of a bitch! Kairi was dumbstruck at the foul language her nobody was using. I would never say something like that, she thought, whether Naminé heard or not. Naminé raised her Keyblade above her head and prepared to strike at the Heartless. The armored knight instinctively raised both of its sword arms together to block the attack. With a mighty cry, Naminé threw the island's fire down in a brutal slash. Her anger strengthened the blow and made it so powerful that it cut straight through both swords and cleaved through the Heartless's armor like a hot knife through warm butter. Kairi simply stood shocked as Naminé turned towards her. I think I'll be all right, she said, and the battle raged. Pete was standing on one of the cliffs on each side of the Great Maw, and he did not like what he saw. Huh, he said to himself, rubbing his chin. Even though Maleficent left this massive army of Heartless here, and it grew because of that stupid town's defenses, and they've managed to separate the nitwits, those twerps are still best in the Heartless. Pete placed his head in his hands and began rubbing the back of his pointy ears. Oh, if they can do this, how are Cossacks and what's-his-name, Nixian, going to handle themselves? As Pete mulled over the current situation, he heard a voice carried by the wind cry, Holy! Pete looked up in surprise at what was taking place on the battlefield. Several large white spheres were appearing around the majority of the Heartless, and they began circling the encircled horde before disappearing into the sky. Pete looked in awe as hundreds of tiny rays of light descended upon the Heartless, wiping each on this instant. After what had only taken a few moments, nearly the entire Heartless army had been wiped out. Stupefied, Pete gaped open-mouthed at the great maw for a second before jumping down the cliffs. Unfortunately for him, he couldn't jump the entire distance and tumbled down the last 25 feet or so, landing with a crash in a heap of dirt. Sora and Roxas, still holding their keyblades, looked at the big red and black mound that had just come down from the cliffs. Wondering what it was, Max came up behind them wielding his sword. Sora turned to look at the boy. He was quite worse for wear. There was a long gash across his left arm. His blood-stained red shirt was ripped, and there was red cuts on his chest and back. And there were a few cuts on his legs around the bloodstains of his jeans. Despite all his injuries, Max was smiling. "Okay, Sora," he began with a chuckle. "You were right. You always need someone to watch your back." Max then turned quizzically to the person standing next to Sora. "Who's that?" Sora laughed out loud. "Max," he said, "allow me to introduce my nobody, Roxas." Roxas inclined his head at Max. "Max," Roxas began, "I'm sorry you couldn't kill Sora once when you two were playing Star Wars Battlefront 2. Max scratched his head. "How'd you know about that?" he asked. Roxas grinned and chuckled somewhat. "Because I was standing behind Sora, telling him where you were hiding." Max's expression hardened as he curtly turned his head to Sora. "When we get back to the ship," he ordered, almost incoherently. "Rematch. No nobodies, no mercy." Sora chuckled and placed his hands on his hips. "I'll still beat you," he said. Max shrugged. "I might have a chance to kill you, though," he replied, smiling. "That's all that matters." Carrie, Naminé, Leon, Aerith, and the Gullwings came up behind them with their weapons. Unnoticed, Max continued his tirade. "So how many Heartless did you two nail anyway?" Sora and Roxas smirked. 1,156, Sora said proudly. "Aw, man," Roxas whined. "I only got 187, although I did only start 10 minutes ago." Each of them looked at Max. 712, he announced. Sora and Roxas nodded admirably. "Awesome job for a newbie," Roxas commented. "Is that all you guys talk about?" Naminé asked, crossing her arms. "Beating each other?" Carrie placed her head in her hand. "They're boys, Nam. Everything's a contest between them." Max lurked inquiringly at Carrie while pointing at Naminé. "Who?" he half asked. Carrie looked up. "Naminé," she answered. Max's expression was still puzzled, yet his gaze followed Naminé as she ran into Roxas's arms and kissed him. Max turned back to Carrie as Aerith healed the party's wounds with the Curaga spell. "My nobody," she finished with a smile. "Everyone here have a nobody?" Max asked aloud. Maleficent has two," a voice from behind them. "We'll all be dead before you see him." They turned around to see Pete standing behind them. Suddenly 5 keyblades, 2 swords, 1 miniature, a gunblade, a minuscule pistol, and 2 tiny daggers used by thieves were pointed at him. "I can see where this is going," Pete said fearfully as he ran back to where the remainder of the Heartless were congregating. "I'm going to show you what it means when people can mess with the mighty Pete," he roared. "This is going to be a cakewalk," Sora muttered to his friends before charging at Pete. The Gullwings quickly flew ahead of Sora and over the Heartless to take the first offensive against Pete. Una fired a few quick rounds at Pete's gut, and pain through a slash at the back of his right knee. Pete howled in pain as he knelt to the ground. Riku used the opportunity to maneuver around him until a certain pocket caught her eye. "Drana Yud Hudrek Lead Sidam," she said, slicing it open. Out of the pocket poured copious amounts of money. "Takers, keepers," Riku announced excitedly, scooping it up with the assistance of Una and Pain. "Stupid little backstabbing," Pete muttered. Pain turned around and glared at him with her red eyes. "Are you sure you want to finish that sentence?" she growled. Pete whimpered as Pain turned her back on him. Sora grinned as he broke through the Heartless meat shield Pete had used to defend himself. "Treasure hunters," Sora said in admiration. Una looked up from her work, smiling. "Thank you," she said. Pete leapt up from the ground. "I've had enough of this," he glared. He drew a large ball from out of his pocket that had not been ripped in Riku's hunt for money, and rolled it at Sora. Acting on instinctively, Sora deftly whacked the ball back at his master, where it exploded in a fireball upon impact, pushing Pete back onto the hard earth. Pete got back from the ground. "Get out of my way," he yelled, punching Sora back. As Sora staggered, Pete jumped up in the air and landed with a crash, creating a shockwave that sent Sora and the Gullwings crashing to the ground. "Ow!" Riku said, massaging her posterior. "That hurts." Sora rose from the ground to see Pete menacingly advancing towards him. Sora leapt straight for Pete, artfully swinging his keyblades in front of him, stringing a vicious combo against Pete's gut. Roxas then jumped in behind Pete and attacked him from the air, keeping him pinned between the three keyblades. Pete's stamina is incredible, Roxas thought. Suddenly Pete rose into the air, and a barrier formed around him, blocking him from attack. Ha ha! He laughed, pleased at his defenses. Pete's invincible. Sora smirked and looked around for Max. He spotted him stabbing his sword through one of the remaining few armored knights. Hey Max, Sora called. Max turned and ran towards Sora. What is it, Sora? He asked. Sora nudged his head in the direction of the invincible Pete. You see that giant sphere of a shield around Pete? He asked. Max looked and nodded his head, perplexed as to how they were going to get through it. Sora nodded. I want you to whack it towards the cliffs with your sword as hard as you can. Max looked skeptically at Sora, but ran forwards anyway. Take this, Pete! Max yelled as he threw his blow. Pete laughed as Max's weapon glanced off his shield, but he was quickly singing a different tune as he started rapidly rolling backwards towards the cliffs. With a resounding crash, the shield broke and he tumbled to the ground in a heap. Sora smirked and raised the Oblivion, concentrating on the rising falls that used to be in Hollow Bastion. Water! Sora yelled, and a jet of water streamed its way towards Pete, completely soaking him and drenching him. Sora quickly shifted his focus from the water to the frozen treat of ice cream. Bazaga! He yelled. The water had been soaking Pete suddenly froze, leaving him encased in a frozen prison. Karia and the others finished off the Heartless and came to Sora's side. Cool, Yuna said in awe. Everyone groaned at her comment, and Yuna looked around. What? She asked, and they heard a shattering noise. Pete had broken free of his frozen packaging, shivering. That was cold, he stuttered thickly before retreating. I think I'll take care of you nitwits next time, he yelled as he conjured up a swirling portal of darkness, withdrawing from the Radiant Garden. I won't tell Maleficent of what just happened, he thought privately. Those nobodies and her don't need to know about this. Good riddance, Payne said, staring at the portal as it disappeared. Roxas and Naminé dismissed their keyblades, and everyone looked on in astonishment as they faded from being solid back into their spectral selves. Knew it had something to do with the keyblades, Roxas muttered sadly. Sora and Kairi gazed sympathetically at their nobodies when a light began to shine from Sora's pocket. Huh? Max said as Sora retrieved the picture of his and Kairi's first kiss. Sora realized that as the picture hovered in the air, he closed his eyes and held the Oblivion with both hands. A giant image of his three-pointed crown glowing on the ground under him. Wind came and swirled all around him, the currents whipping his spiked hair around and filling his vest like a sail. Great dark clouds in twilight appeared, and an aura of light surrounded the picture. A shaft of light shot straight from the aura into the air, creating a large keyhole. Sora looked up and leapt back, flourishing his keyblade. A beam of light radiated from the Oblivion's tip and flowed into the keyhole. With a metallic click, light began radiating out of the keyhole, bringing the landscape back to normal. What just happened? Riku asked. Sora turned to her. The road to a new world has opened. He nodded. Kairi's face brightened in understanding. So that's what you meant, Sora said. Sora nodding, Leon looked at them. We should be able to handle ourselves here, Sora, he said. You should go, or else Maleficent might send those nobodies after you. Sora nodded and he motioned to his party, Roxas and Naminé flowing back into his and Kairi's minds. Upon entering the bridge, Max brought up the holographic image of a map of the worlds, searching for the new one. Sora and Kairi were looking over his shoulder when something caught Sora's eyes. Radiant Garden was now linked with a world with a large clock tower. Max looked down for the name. Sora, have you ever been to a place called Neverland? He asked. Sora nodded, eyes glowing. Yeah, set a course for that world, he instructed, happiness creeping into his voice. I want to see how Peter Pan and Wendy are doing. Max nodded and programmed the autopilot to take them into the new world. He sighing and he completed his task. 15 hours until arrival, he said, before his face brightened. Well, if it's going to take that long, Kairi said, yawning, I'm going to go to sleep. She lightly kissed Sora on the cheek. Good night, my love, she said, with a smile and small giggle. Sora smiled wistfully, turned turned to her as she walked down the steps. "Good night, my beloved princess," he called. Carrie did not slow her pace. "I thought I ordered you not to call me princess," she toyed playfully before entering her room. Sora sighed and turned to Max, who was staring at him. "Rematch. No nobodies. Now." And that was Chapter 10, The Garden. As you probably heard multiple times through there, certain voices were just plain different from what I had originally started as, which is why I'm asking for people to, if you want to be part of the story and voice a character or two, then message me on Twitter or find me on Skype, because Skype is where I will be doing some of the recordings, in which I will then go with the audio that I record on my own. So then, find me on Twitter at Megai1 or find me on Skype at Megai Kurosaki1. May the grace of the Valor protect you.